Hello, my name's Joanna Bourke. I'm really pleased to be able to talk to you today. Really looking forward to this whole session. My paper explores the meaning of knowledge for male and female members of the London Mechanics Institution, as well as those who managed that institution. And you can read a more detailed analysis of the arguments in the written version of this paper, which you all should have received in the pack. So I'm just really, in the next quarter of an hour, going to summarize some of the main components of that talk. Just to give you some context, this talk is part of the history of the London Mechanics Institution, Birkbeck, that I'm writing for the college's bicentenary in 2023, and it's going to be published by OUP in September 2022. The paper version has a typo. It says it's going to be published in September 2021. 22 it is. One chapter in this book looks at the social controls arguments that are so dominant in the historiography of the mechanics institutes. The basic argument goes that mechanics institutions inhibited workers' militancy. In particular, they have lamented the absence in the London Mechanics Institution of an explicitly revolutionary rhetoric or radical ideology. So Marxist or Marxist-inspired historians keen on recovering the history of the working classes have been in the forefront of these arguments. So in the words of Adrian Desmond, writing in the History of Science journal in 1987, one of the really early works on this in this field, the Mechanics Institution were an attempt to curb the insurrectional tendencies of a targeted elite amongst the working classes. They were engaged, as he put it, in camouflaging capitalism's alienating features. This was also succinctly expressed by the really, I think, really wonderful historian Richard Johnson in a very influential article that he wrote in Past and Present. And according to him, the early Victorian obsession with the education of the poor is best understood as a concern about authority, about power, about the assertion or the reassertion of control. This concern was expressed in an enormously ambitious attempt to determine through the capture of educational means the patterns of thought, sentiment, and behavior of the working class. For such historians, autonomous expressions of working class culture could be found instead in the Owenites' halls of science, which had a very short life between 1839 and 1841. Now, there's a great deal of merit in social control arguments. Indeed, it doesn't take much research at all to dig up relatively straightforward examples of social, political, economic, and religious elites lauding the institutes for precisely that reason. And my book and the extract and the paper version of this talk provides numerous examples of just that. One of the thousands of trenchant criticisms came from Engels in The Condition of the Working Class in England, published in 1844. And Engels famously reproached the Mechanics Institutes for being organs for the dissemination of the sciences useful to the bourgeoisie. Their teachings were tame, flabby, subservient to the ruling politics and religion. Engels denounced the institutions for propagating a constant sermon upon quiet obedience, passivity, and resignation to his fate. Now, of course, Engels was a firm proponent of workers' education, but he believed it should be conducted in proletarian reading rooms run by the workers themselves, rather than being sponsored by wealthy men such as George Birkbeck and Brougham. Now, undoubtedly, the Victorian belief in the reforming potentialities of useful knowledge, particularly those focused on engineering, technology, design, was widely held. This was why George Birkbeck, the London Mechanics Institution, and exhibition movement, especially the National Repository, had such strong ties. Education served a moral function. It was temperance friendly. It imparted the values of emerging capitalism. It taught appropriate gender as well as class relations, and it was central to a racialist, expansionist, imperial mission. Okay, so I'm agreeing with all that, but I do think that it's too easy to exaggerate both, first, the degree to which these elites self-consciously sought to manipulate working men and women into acquiescence to dominant power regimes, and two, the effectiveness of their attempts. Where there is power, there is always resistance. So first, I think it's important not to minimize the extent to which early supporters of the movement fought vigorously for radical causes. This was not incompatible with a view that combinations, that is trade unions, strikes, mass protests, popular violence against property or persons had proved ineffectual in the face of the formidable economic and political powers wielded by the state of early capitalism. The founders and early members of the Mechanics' Institutes were not proposing to abandon aggressive political tactics, but they believed it was strategically important to pursue them alongside more pacific activities, including workers' education. Second, the LMI, London Mechanics' Institution, was founded at a time of intense political turmoil, as suffrage campaigner Richard Carlisle bluntly noted in his Address to Men of Science, 1821. They were living in an age of revolution, suppressed only by the force of fixed bayonets and despotic laws. He was referring to, amongst many, many other repressions, the brutal Peterloo massacre of 1819. And there were numerous other grim reminders. I mean, 1820s execution of the men involved in the Cato Street conspiracy. But there are numerous grim reminders to working men and women of the lengths to which the royalists would go to suppress dissent. The LMI was established only 3 years later, and in fact, very close to the place of execution. It was a reasonable assumption for men and women who wanted radical change to believe that the more aggressive forms of radicalism had failed. Why not try other ways of changing the world? Now, in hindsight, the new model based on workers' education failed to effectively challenge capitalist modes of production. But the radical men and women who placed hope in education, self-improvement, and developing organizational skills and experiences were not lily-livered for being wary of the reactionary bellowing mobs that they would have heard from their lodgings. Third point I want to make is a more pragmatic one. In practice, political debates continued. The managing committee of the LMI were worried about a political backlash and resolved not to rent rooms to radical groups. But pragmatic financial needs trumped these anxieties. Newspaper reports noted that members of the LMI had to be repeatedly warned to avoid politics, implying that they routinely ignored the ban. The LMI rented out their rooms and lecture theatres to some of the most radical organisations of the time: the Friends of Civil and Political Liberty, the Owenite London Cooperative Society, trade unions and other combinations, the Society for Promoting Radical Reform, led by the notorious agitator Henry Hunt. There were meetings about the present distress of the labouring classes, the working conditions of engineers and builders, the injustice of the newspaper tax, the need to repeal the Corn Laws, the urgent need for socialism promoted in the LMI by the formidable radical Robert Owen, and the importance of supporting strikes and forcing through more labour protections. It was the members who pushed for a change in the policy. Indeed, the management committee of the LMI would have found it difficult to categorically prohibit debate. Its early founders, including George Birkbeck, did not think that there was anything to fear from lively yet respectful debate. Furthermore, the institution prided itself on its educational policy of what they called mutual instruction. In other words, students themselves, members as they were called, were regarded as active searchers after knowledge rather than passive recipients of the information of others. As one commentator put it in the 1830s, this meant that, questions of politics, class, morality were in fact widely discussed in classes. Even if members were discouraged from directly pontificating on political matters, the nature of the classes meant that such topics inevitably arose. Now, the type of useful knowledge promoted at the LMI was also radical. Now, lots of examples I could give here. The example I give in the paper, published version of the written version of the paper, is phrenology, which dominated scientific teaching at the institution for decades. It was a potentially radical science that offered the possibility of human perfection. It directly challenged religious dogma, jettisoning ideas about original sin, and substituting a philosophy that opened up a wealth of possibilities for human renewal. Through the kind of education provided by the Mechanics Institutes, people could better understand and change both themselves and their worlds. In the words of J.L. Levinson, speaking at the LMI, the science of phrenology would place happiness and moral good within the reach of all, and make the earth, instead of a scene of vice and bloodshed, comparatively a terrestrial paradise. Now, such rhetoric, of course, flamed critics at the time. Phrenologists shocked people by making comparisons between human and non-human animals. Theological critics believed that the metaphysical soul was one and indivisible. Therefore, they reasoned it was nothing less than sacrilegious to break up the pure entity into different faculties and locate them separately in different parts of the brain. As a materialist science, phrenology promoted atheism. Indeed, the teaching of science in all its forms, including anatomy and phrenology, directly challenged some of the moral pieties and ideological principles of the time. The teaching of science at a period when it was developing fast was in itself radical, especially since science was the main adversary of religion. By disseminating scientific views to the working class, the London Mechanics Institution was part of the radical Enlightenment. Finally, did the membership of the LMI become less working class and more socially conformist? Well, some of the founders, Robinson in particular, of the LMI believed so, complaining that the classes increasingly served not mechanics, but other working people, such as clerks and shopkeepers. These members demanded more entertaining topics. Historians who support this critique forget that it masks a masculinist bias. After all, the classes offered as evidence of conventionality tended to be the ones attracting female members. They include the predominantly female singing and art classes. Yet, admitting women as students was a pioneering step. Offering classes that appealed to those women was important, especially since such classes allowed them to earn an independent income, for instance, as tutors. In a highly gendered as well as classed society, the relative decline in topics that attracted working men and the relative rise in those attracting working women should not be seen as evidence of conservatism, but rather an expression of different gendered options. Now, in the paper version of this talk, I explore this in relation to the attendance of women in classes from the 1830s onwards. They were even allowed to attend George Birkbeck's anatomy classes. And, this may not sound radical, but human anatomy at the time was an extremely radical science, largely because it substituted providential design for a naturalistic framework that could easily become, and did become, anti-clerical. The idea of allowing women, as well, by the way, as working men, to gaze upon the mechanisms of the human body was therefore morally dangerous. The study of nature encouraged a materialistic philosophy of matter that was seen as blasphemous. When this philosophy was made available to women, the potentials for disrupting hierarchies of power were even more manifest. And I do think it's also worth asking why working men and women should be expected only to attend serious lectures. At different times, in other words, to conclude, at different times and for often pragmatic reasons, members of the LMI would emphasize their moderation or their desire for radical changes to a society based on class and gender hierarchies that harmed their interests. They often disagreed with the policies promoted by the institution's management and pushed the LMI away from its stated moderation. At times, instrumental goals, such as securing financial support from wealthy patrons, encourage them to emphasize the more pacifying aims of education. At other times, members acted according to personal priorities and class concerns. They might also express weariness with the demands of endless revolution or their desire to relax after a long day's work. There was nothing in these positions which excluded political engagement and political activism. Thanks very much.
Well, thanks, Joanna. That's a real tour de force, and it certainly sets the context of what these mechanics institutes were tackling, you know, to be setting out to take on the clergy and a number of other challenging areas of protectionism, if you like. I wondered, I mean, how does the work relate in a way to some of the challenges that are going on today? You know, and that's quite a big question. And I'm just thinking, I mean, how, you know, because we're in a university sector, we have this platforming, no platforming, we have some of the government trying to restrict, you know, we have the focus on STEM subjects, you know, I mean, there are lots of things going on within our universities today in education. And it sounds almost as if some of them were going on the same.
Yeah, I mean, oh, absolutely. I mean, today our universities are in crisis with, you know, increased neoliberal impositions being placed upon us. As you mentioned, the restrictions on what we are supposed to be teaching, and particularly the emphasis on the arts and humanities. I think what I find really interesting about when I look back at the LMI is that just how much the members at the time attempted and were always in this constant struggle with governments, with the governors, with their leaders, their betters, and how they attempted to get back some of their power to decide what was being taught in classes. And we've heard this in a number of other papers that were given earlier today, that, you know, that trying to govern and rule and take control over their own intellectual life. And that I find actually is really reassuring and encouraging for all of us. I think also, and one of the things I only really touched on at the end of my talk was the really important role of gender, and particularly femininity in these early mechanics institutions. I mean, the London Mechanics Institution, you know, accepted women as members as early as the 1830, which of course is 20 years before women's were allowed into other colleges and universities. So the real important role of women also in deciding and saying, you know, actually, we don't want to learn mechanics, we want to learn design, for example, and that these are the topics that will get us employment. And certainly you see in the London Mechanics Institution that a huge proportion of the lecturers are actually female. So this was providing women in those really early years, your 1830s through to the 1860s, with a platform to give their views, to be intellectual figures within a community. And I find that also something really inspiring for us today.
Well, that comes out both in the history of, you know, Heriot Watt, but also in the history of University College, which presumably was one of the LMI we had another LMI from Tasmania, didn't we? We got two LMIs. We got one from London and one from Launceston. So LMI came up in a couple of contexts there. But this role of bringing women into the educational sphere is certainly something that the Mechanics Institutes as a whole collectively must have been strongly involved in.
And if I could just say something here, Pat, because I think the other thing, and I'm probably laboring this point a bit too much because I did mention it earlier, but this idea of mutual instruction, at least in the LMI, and I've now discovered at other places as well, which I wasn't aware of. So thank you for earlier speakers, but it was really very important because it provided working men and women with a way to rehearse their own arguments, to influence the agenda, the intellectual agenda, to experiment and to learn really important political tools, such as, it may sound small, but political tools just such as how to take minutes, how to construct an argument, the logics of debate, that they then transferred into more obvious political spheres.
And I think those many people know this, but Birkbeck is well known for its evening classes. So you are, in fact, I've had a PhD student that did his evening classes at Birkbeck and came on to do a PhD with us. So he learnt mathematics in evening classes, a mathematics degree. So Birkbeck has also opened up that area as well, and continues to do that.
Yeah, I mean, we are the leading institution for providing evening education for working Londoners. And with the pandemic, we've actually been really lucky because, of course, we can now speak outside, not only to Londoners online. So it's been great. But that is what we do because, in the current climate, in particular political climate, but also economic climate, this need to educate ourselves, educate other people is never more urgent, given the huge range of disasters, and I am using that word, that we are facing in terms of climate change, in terms of lack of trust in our political systems, the undermining of democracy. These are big problems, and sorry, the pandemic, these are big problems that need to be addressed by each and every global citizen. And Birkbeck provides, and the London Mechanics Institution in the past provides that opportunity to really engage in all parts of our lives, not just when we're 18-year-olds.
There's some comments coming through, which I think you can pick up in the chat and you might want to answer, but I think we'll move on to Kieran